Hello, I'm Arik, Communications Director at League of Education Voters. Welcome to our free online webinar series, Lunchtime Webinars. We started this series 5 years ago to share information and build knowledge on important and timely issues. Today's webinar is on the current state of education funding. The Washington State Legislature has continued work on school funding in the aftermath of the Supreme Court's McCleary ruling, but inequities between school districts remain. Our speaker today is Julia Warth, Director of Policy and Research here at League of Education Voters. I should be able to say the name of my organization. She will outline education funding changes made in the 2019 session, illustrate current funding inequities through interactive maps of Washington's 295 school districts, and answer your questions. Julia Warth joined League of Education Voters, LEV, in 2015. Before then, she worked as a senior research analyst for the Washington State Board of Education, helped launch the Washington State Charter Schools Association, and worked in public policy consulting. Julia is committed to helping create a school system in which every student has access to an education that prepares and empowers. She received her bachelor's in literature and government from Claremont McKenna College in Southern California and returned home to Seattle for her Master of Education degree from the University of Washington. When she's not in the office, Julia enjoys playing in the mountains and spending time with her family. A couple of housekeeping items before we begin. You'll notice a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. This is a space for you to submit questions to us. As always, feel free to send any feedback about the webinar quality to us on the chat function or at info@educationvoters.org. Welcome, Julia.
Great, thank you so much, Arik. And thank you everybody for joining today. So as Arik said, we will be going through the changes that occurred in the 2019 legislative session to the local levy system. And this is a continuation of work that the legislature has been engaging in for many, many years, but most recently 2017 and 2018 to address the Supreme Court's McCleary ruling. We'll then be going through a series of maps about the changes to the local levy system and what types of access districts will have to varying levy amounts. So with that, so as a refresher, since there have been many changes, after 2017, or rather during the 2017 session, the legislature passed House Bill 2242. This was the major funding system overhaul legislation in response to the Supreme Court's McCleary ruling. And among the myriad things that this legislation did, it altered the cap system for local levies. So districts beginning in 2019 would be subject to a new structure for how their local levies were capped. So I won't go into the previous cap system because it's very wonky, but this quote-unquote current cap system is that districts are capped at raising either $2,500 per student or a tax rate of $1.50 per $1,000 of assessed property value, whichever of these two things results in a lower tax rate. So if a district is able to raise $2,500 per student by taxing their property owners only 80 cents per $1,000, then that is their cap tax rate. If they raise, let's say, only $2,000 per student, by taxing their property owners $1.50 per $1,000, then that is their cap. Districts that receive local effort assistance from the state were capped at a lower amount per student. So they are capped at $1,500 per student or a tax rate of $1.50 per $1,000. And local effort assistance is a program that the state uses to try to kind of build some more fairness, I wouldn't say equity, but some fairness into the local levy system. So it acknowledges that districts have different property values and so different capacity in terms of ability to raise local levy dollars. And so the state comes in with some additional funding for districts that have really low property values and so aren't able to raise as much money through their local levies. So the system that was put into place, however, creates this two-tiered cap. So if you are a district with high property values and a high capacity for raising local dollars, you're capped at $2,500 per student. If you're a district with low property values and so low capacity to raise local levy dollars, you're capped at a lower amount. You're capped at $1,500 per student. So it doesn't take into account potential community need or acknowledge that districts with lower property values might also be lower income districts and so might have higher need students. It actually puts less money into those potentially higher need districts than the high property value districts. So hopefully that was about as clear as mud. So what happened in 2019? Going into the 2019 session, a number of school districts informed their legislators that they were actually looking at budget shortfalls. So despite the increase in state funding, this new cap system under local levies actually resulted in some districts not having enough money in the budget. And so there was the potential of layoffs to happen in this coming school year, in the 2019-2020 school year, once the new levy system fully went into effect. As I mentioned earlier, the 2017 levy system also created disparities across the state in terms of access to this enrichment funding based on property wealth, so this two-tiered cap, which was something that League of Education Voters was very concerned about. So the debate on what to do about local levies went well into the 11th hour of legislative session. I believe that Senate Bill 5313 passed in the middle of the night before session was due to, or the day before session was due to end. And so there was significant debate. This was the final compromise. Senate Bill 5313 changes the cap structure slightly. So there is still a $2,500 per pupil cap. However, the tax rate cap is now $2.50 per $1,000 of assessed value. So remember, previously it was $1.50 per $1,000 of assessed value. Now, if you are a district that could raise that at $1.50 per $1,000, only raise $2,000 per student, you now can levy a higher tax up to $2,500 per student. So let's say it takes you $2 per $1,000 of assessed value to get to $2,000 per student, you now can levy that higher tax. There are just a few districts that actually are able to levy that higher amount. So Tacoma is a good example. They will now be able to raise more than the $1.50 per $1,000. It also increased, the legislation also increased the local effort assistance cap to $1,550 per student instead of the $1,500 flat per student. So there's a slight increase in the amount of money that the state will put in for local effort assistance, but it still doesn't get anywhere close to closing that $1,000 gap between the two types of districts. It also had some carve-outs for individual districts. So Seattle's cap is now $3,000 per student. The language is in the bill is any district over 40,000 students that are enrolled. So, you know, should any district in the state experience a significant increase in population, they would also be able to access this $3,000 per student cap. It also increased the local effort assistance amount for Vancouver and Evergreen school districts down in Clark County for the 2019 biennium. So this is not in perpetuity, but just for the next 2 budget years. Senate Bill 5313 also included new reporting and audit requirements on the use of local and state dollars. So there was a desire among legislators to have a better understanding of how local dollars are being spent, where they are being spent, and where there are still gaps potentially in state funding. Many districts said not only that they needed the local money for enrichment activities, but that there were still significant gaps in some of the basic education funding, in particular in special education funding, and so local dollars are being used for that, to fill that gap for districts. And so the legislature wants a better understanding of that. And so there are some new reporting requirements in addition to those that were put into place in 2017 and 2018. All right. So what are the impacts of the changes made in the 2019 legislative session? So as I mentioned, there's still a disparity in access to enrichment funds. And if districts are using their enrichment funds, their local funds, to fill gaps left in the state funding system, that means that districts have disparate access in order to fill those gaps. And so if you are a district that struggles to raise local levy dollars but is also underfunded in the area of special education, you might not be able to fully fund your special education programming. Districts that were not already at that $2,500 per pupil levy can now raise more money. As I said, Tacoma is an example of this. So one caveat here is that burden for additional enrichment is still placed on the local taxpayer. So Tacoma is a district that also receives local effort assistance from the state. And their local effort assistance amount is not going to increase, aside from that extra $50 per student, because that cap is higher now. But their tax rate on their local taxpayer will increase in order to generate additional local enrichment funding. It also remains to be seen if these changes will actually prevent the budget crises that were predicted by districts. We do not yet know if it will prevent some of the layoffs that were predicted, and if it is enough enough additional funding in enough districts that needed it to cover those remaining holes in state funding as well. All right, so I think now is where we will switch over to the map. So bear with us as we work our technology magic here. This share and do a new one. All right, so hopefully everybody can see these. So we've got a series of 5 maps here, and I will walk through them fairly briefly in the interest of time. They will be available online, and you can go into them and click on the various district names, and it'll provide you with the detailed information about that district. And so that's really actually the fun part, is to go in and dig into the data. They're not quite as interesting just in zoomed out in big picture. But I'll explain briefly what each of the maps shows, and then please do go online and play around with them and let us know if you have additional questions or thoughts. So this first map here that I wanted to touch on is levy resources per student. And so this is really just shows the distribution of access to per pupil levy amounts, and that includes local effort assistance funding from the state in the 2019-2020 school year. And so not a whole lot has changed in terms of distribution of access to levy funds compared to the maps we generated after the 2017 and 2018 legislative sessions. So hopefully we'll have the capacity, once we get all these online, for you to be able to kind of click through the different years and see if the distribution has changed, but I can tell you right now it has not. But you are welcome to go see for yourself. Let's see. So I did also want to point out on this map that this includes the 2019-2020 levy rates that have been approved by voters in districts. And so some districts, when they went back out to their voters in this most recent levy cycle, actually asked their voters to approve levy rates higher than what was allowed under current state law. And the idea being that if the state law didn't change, they would just levy the amount that was allowed under state law. But if the levy cap did change in the 2019 session, they would also be able, they wouldn't have to go back out, the district wouldn't have to go back out to their voters to approve a new levy. They'd already have the authorization to levy at that higher amount. And so there are some districts on this map who are able to do that, right? So Seattle and Tacoma being two of them, but there are others around the state. And then there are other districts who, in their most recent round of levies, only ask their voters to approve up to the amount allowed under the 2017 legislation. And so they are still at that previous cap and would need to go back out to their voters in order to ask for that higher levy amount now that it's allowed under state law. So this map doesn't reflect that all districts who can raise more will raise more, because they have, not all districts have gone out to their voters and asked for that additional funding yet. All right. The next map, oh, good, it loaded. We were having some technical difficulty earlier. The next map is about levy and LEA accessibility. And this map shows the amount per pupil that each district can raise per $1 of levy. So the idea being to be able to show kind of what each district's capacity is to raise money per every dollar that they tax their citizens, or their property owners rather. And so there are some districts who, in the dark green, at $1 per thousand or even less, are able to raise that $2,500 per student very easily. There are other districts here in the light green that per $1 of levy are able to raise less than $1,000. So this is to give you a sense of the capacity, and then the green dots that are overlaid on top of it note the districts that are above the state average enrollment of low-income students. And so the trend that you see here are the districts that have the lower capacity to raise local levy dollars are also the districts that are over the state average for low-income students. And so it highlights that disparity of access to additional funds and potential increase or potentially higher student need in those districts. So the districts with lower access to the additional funds also have higher need student populations. Now, obviously, there are other categories of student need, like English language learners and students receiving special education services, but this is just focused on income on this particular map. All right. So then the next map I want to show is the percent of levy capacity that's actually used. So the previous map was about, how easy it might be for a district to raise a significant amount through local levies. This map highlights which districts and their voters are taxing themselves at the maximum allowable amount. And then the same overlay here of districts that are above the state average enrollment of low-income students. And what you see is that even these districts that may not have had as much levy or may not have had as easy of a time raising additional funds through local levies are still taxing themselves at the maximum amount, even in low-income communities. And this highlights that communities are willing to invest in their schools, even if it is a larger burden on them as a community. And so also just wanted to highlight that districts and local taxpayers are willing to put this effort into their schools as well. All right, and I think then the next map. Here we go. So this map here shows the combined state and local funding that is projected for 2019 and 2020, so for the next school year. And similar to the map about levy resources per student, there's that issue with the levy rates that some districts will already be able to access that higher levy rate, and some districts will have to go back out to their voters again for it. So there's some wonkiness there, shall we say. But really wanted to highlight in this map, and it's similar to the maps produced in 2017 and 2018, that our funding system still does not distribute money based off of student need. And while you can't necessarily tell that based on the geography, if you begin to click through some of the individual districts, this starts to come out. So for example, if you're looking at Marysville, and they have a low-income student enrollment that is above the state average, and they're at around 47%, their combined funding is $14,668. If you come up here to Stanwood-Camano, which would arguably be in the same area in terms of regionalization from the state and things of that nature, they have a low income enrollment of only 26% of their student body, and they combined funding have about the same amount per pupil as Marysville. And that is because they're able to raise a lot more through their local funding than Marysville is. So if we were to have a funding system, so this really highlights that our funding system still doesn't actually account for the need in the district. And even if the state funding is more for Marysville, the local funding winds up basically negating that. And so Stanwood-Camano is going to have more local capacity to fill in those state gaps than Marysville is and meet those student needs. I'd also note that both of these districts are over the 13.5% special education funding cap. And so here again, Stanwood-Camano is going to have more local capacity to fill in that gap than Marysville is. All right. And then the last map, which also loaded. This is great. This last map here shows the total per pupil levy resources with, and this time the dots indicate which districts are over the special education funding cap. So whereas previously we were looking at students that are low income, now this map is showing districts with higher enrollments of students receiving special education services. So, you know, again, similarly, you have lots of districts that are over the cap. So for example, here, Darrington, they're over the cap in terms of enrollment of special education students, and are actually lower in terms of their capacity to raise local levy resources. And so we'll have fewer resources to serve those students that are not funded by the state. All right. So that is it for the maps. Gonna stop sharing this, go back to the PowerPoint really quickly.
And then if you don't mind, we can go back to the, pick a map and we'll just hover on that because it'll be a lot easier for me to get to questions.
Sure, great. So just finally here, wanted to highlight the remaining work. So as the maps show, we have a funding system that still doesn't target all of the resources in the system based on student and community needs. State funding does not account for the full cost of serving all students, you know, such as students that are receiving special education services, and that the access to enrichment funds is unequal across the state, and so districts have varying capacities to either fill in those gaps or to offer enrichment opportunities to their students, which is what local dollars are supposed to be used for. And then, so there is remaining work to be done around advocating and designing a system that actually recognizes, accounts, and funds the true costs and needs of students. And then finally, also monitoring the new data that will hopefully be available through the new state reporting system and the new state audits to determine how money is being spent in the districts and where there are still gaps. So with that, I see Arik looking at the clock, so I'm gonna go back to the maps and we can get going on questions.
Alrighty, so now it's your turn. Thank you so much, Julia. That was awesome. We got about 10 minutes or so, and if you have a question, just go to the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. No question is too basic, and sure enough, we have one already, which is, other than Tacoma, which few school districts can now go above the previous $1.50 per $1,000 of assessed value levy rate?
That is a really good question. I don't know the names of the rest of them off the top of my head, but can get back to you on that.
All right, great. And I have a question, which is, are we better off now that we're in 2019 than before the legislature made this sweeping overhaul of school funding in 2017?
I think it depends on what your definition of better is. I think that, you know, the state has infused a significant amount of additional state resources into the system, but there has not been significant change in how that money is distributed and in the funding formula itself and how it accounts for student need and distributes and targets funding based on student need. So there's more money in the system, but it is not necessarily changing practice. It's not necessarily changing the way that students are being served. And then with the changes to the local levy system, most districts experience an increase in funding, but the amount of that increase varies across the state because some districts saw such a significant decrease in their local dollars, and so it may have been kind of a net wash for them. So it's a very district by district answer, I would say, in terms of amount of increase in benefit, and then we still have a long ways to go in terms of our funding system actually being effective in terms of targeting based on students and not just property values or adults in the system.
All right, thank you. We've got a few more questions here. They're rolling in, which is great. Okay, let's start with this. I think you may have already addressed it, but can you clarify if you're able to overlay student achievement / performance relative to the funding data, actual versus capacity?
We did not already address that, so thank you very much for that question. We certainly could do the overlay map-wise. I think we also need to be cautious in terms of making any sort of causal conclusions between funding amounts, what's going into each district, and student outcomes, because there's so many different variables within a district in terms of how students are served, and lots of other factors that also impact, and community needs, things like that, that also impact student achievement. So I know this is something that the state has actually talked about in their accountability system discussions as well, is how to really effectively kind of draw that line between, are we putting enough money into the system and are we getting the outcomes that we want? So it's not just about the amount of money, it's also about how the money gets spent.
Great, thank you. All right, what can you tell us about the impacts of other legislative changes, such as requiring / funding benefits for part-time staff? Are there other significant changes causing reductions in district revenues?
That is a really great question, and thank you for bringing that up. So for folks on the phone, this requiring funding benefits for part-time staff, in the 2017, I think it was 2017, in one of the McCleary pieces of legislation, there was also a change to how staff within school districts, so public education staff, receive their health benefits. And so that now has all moved to a entirely state-run system versus being something that's bargained district by district and actually bargaining unit by bargaining unit within district by district, right? So it used to be thousands of different benefit contracts. There was a change to how part-time staff were treated then under the system, whereas before districts might have been able to prorate the amount of benefits. So if you worked half-time, you got half of your benefits funded through the district. Now, if you work essentially half-time, you get full benefits under the new state system. But the way that the state funding formula works, it doesn't necessarily account for the true number of people eligible. And so districts then have to take on that cost of people that are eligible for full benefits, but might not be funded by the state. And so that is another, some districts have expressed that's a significant driver of what they will need to spend their local levy revenues on and why they're experiencing budget shortfalls. I would say that that is probably the biggest change, because I think the question said, are there other changes like that that are causing this reduction in revenues? I would say that the benefits is probably the largest one.
Okay, thank you. All right, this is great info. Can we get access to the data in Excel format so that we can use it to help advocate to show examples, charts, etc.?
That is a really great question. Arik and I were actually just talking about that before this started, that the maps are cool, but the trends aren't really geographic. It's more about student populations. So we will work on getting the Excel available for folks as well. So you all can play around and have fun with data too.
All right. Could not see Kelso on the special ed population map. What is Kelso's percentage? Let me pop to the, oh, okay.
Yes, so right that should be the right map.
Okay.
And then Kelso is down,
that's right,
south and west a little bit.
So we'll go ahead and zoom in to there.
Should be down further.
Yes.
There it is.
Yes.
Yeah. See it above.
Bingo.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, it's not on the box.
Ah.
All right, it should be on the box. I'm not sure why it's not, but we can look that up for you as well.
Okay, so that's levy per student. Hang on, let's make sure.
Maybe if you click on the dot.
Oh.
Will that work? Nope.
Nope.
All right, apologies about that. We'll make sure that the boxes are updated before these go online.
All right, great. What are your plans for advocating next session?
That is a really good question. These are all good questions. Sorry, I start everything off with that. There is likely a significant amount of school funding fatigue among legislators in 2020. It is also an off budget year. So this most recent session was the big biennial budget. Next year is supposed to be just kind of tweaks. Our plans for advocacy will really be focused most likely on this issue of the continued disparity between districts that get local effort assistance being capped so much lower than districts that can just raise their own local money. And then we are planning in the 2021 legislative session, which will be the next big budget year, to really push for more changes to the funding formula itself, and making sure that it really accounts for student need and then drives resources out based on that. I would be remiss without mentioning that in the 2020 session, we'll also continue to advocate around special education funding, and really see the efforts there and some of the changes that have already been made to the special education funding formula, such as the tiered model that's going to go into place, as a potential way to kind of move the system to be more targeted based on student need, and potentially expanding that model of tiers in special education out to other student groups as well.
All right, thank you. All right, last question. One of the districts I cover used 3 separate levies in the 2017 levy vote to get nearly $3 per $1,000 of assessed value. Is that likely to get challenged in court?
So it depends. There are a couple of different types of levies allowable for districts. So there is the enrichment levy, which used to be called the maintenance and operations levy, and that is the levy that is subject to these levy rate caps. There are also additional levies around sometimes buildings, technology levies, transportation levies, and those are not subject to these caps. And so if those were the additional types of levies, then it may be allowable. And so it really depends on what those levies were for, and I am certainly not a legal expert, so I will not comment on the likelihood of it being challenged in court, but certainly something to investigate.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Julia. Thank you so much for your questions. They were really great questions.
Yes.
Our next webinar is not scheduled yet, and once it's confirmed, we'll post the information on our website and share it on social media. Thanks to each of you for joining us today. If you have any additional questions or comments, please send them to info@educationvoters.org. A recording of today's presentation will be available on our website, educationvoters.org, and feel free to share it with your friends and colleagues. If you would like to learn more about League of Education Voters or support our work, please visit our website, educationvoters.org. Thank you again for attending, and we hope you will join us at future webinars.